Our next speaker is a longtime regular presenter here at Hope, as well as a writer and columnist for 2600. Fans of his work in the magazine would know him as the Telecom Informer. Here to speak with us now about how your mobile phone is tracking you and how to fight back, please welcome T. Profit.
Well, it looks like we're here recording, time to get started. This is way different than I normally do for Hope. I'm used to being in front of a room of a lot of people, and I hope Virtual Hope has been really great for you. Thanks for being here. Thanks for supporting 2600. And this presentation is about how your mobile phone is tracking you and how you can fight back. And you know, I think we all know that our mobile phones are tracking us, but it's kind of tough for that to really be actionable. And it's also hard to understand the full extent of it. So who am I? I'm T. Profit, also known as the Telecom Informer. I write for 2600, and I've been writing since 1990. So it's been 30 years now, which is pretty cool. And if you don't subscribe, I really hope that you do subscribe to 2600 because you know, you are why we do all of this. And I really would love to see more people get interested in telecom because there's a lot there, and we'll dive right in. Let's see if I can figure out how to advance this slide. There we go. So mobile phones used to look like this. I actually had a Motorola Brick when I was in college. They were easily clonable. So you could actually wire up a parallel cable to these terminals on the back, you know, underneath the battery. And if you did that and you ran a program called mot66.exe on a 386DX25 and nothing else, you could change the ESN and min pair. And, you know, basically these were just mostly radios. You know, they started off being made by Motorola. You know, they were pretty solid as radios. The security wasn't all that good. And, you know, they certainly didn't have any capabilities to be tracked down. Like, you could do it, but it wasn't a device that was inherently designed to really, you know, figure out where you physically were located or report that anywhere. And so some of you may have seen this if you've been around Hope for a long time, or 2600. This is Kevin Mitnick. He was actually wanted by the US Marshals, and it was hard for them to track him down, even though he was on teleconferences on cloned cellular phones every day practically. And the reason for this is that tracking phones wasn't easy in 1995, especially if you were cloning them, as Kevin was doing. You know, he was basically using stolen credentials, loading them onto his phone, and, you know, calling as someone else. So it was really tough to figure out, you know, where he was at the time. The information wasn't nearly as available on the network side as it is today. So ultimately, if you've read the book Takedown, and he'll probably hate that I mentioned this, but by Shimamura, the method that they used to find and ultimately apprehend Kevin Mitnick was triangulation. And so what they did is figured out which phone that he was on, and from there they were able to force the phone to ping between multiple towers. They were then able to infer an area where he likely was, and they got it down to an apartment complex. And from there, it was just wait and see, and eventually he was apprehended. And so, you know, it used to take real work, and this is a theme that I've kind of hammered on a lot at Hope. It used to take real work to actually track somebody down. If you wanted to do that, in the telecommunications world. You'd have to go down to a central office to tap a phone, or you'd have to, go out into the field to find somebody who was using a cloned mobile device. This wasn't an easy thing to do. It actually took work, and it these days is a very different situation. So how did all of that start? Like many things, it started with 911. So, there was a really big problem in the early 90s. The popularity of cell phones exploded. Everybody was getting them, and then they started calling 911 with problems that they needed, resolved, and they didn't actually know where they were. And this is a pretty common problem. So, what do you do if you call 911 and you don't know where you are? On a traditional landline phone, and I'll show the architecture a little bit later on a different slide, the phone company was connected to a database of where everything was, and all of that information got sent over to 911 when you called. And so it was no secret, anywhere that you were calling 911 from. But on a mobile phone, they didn't have any information at all when you called in. In fact, it didn't always get routed to a 911 public safety access point. Here in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of the time you'd call 911 and it would go to the State Patrol. Why? Well, back then, most people were using mobile phones in cars, and they were using them while they were driving, and so most of the calls that came in involved things on the highways, and so that's why they picked the State Patrol as where to send the calls. So, if you were calling to report a fire, the State Patrol would try to figure out where you were, and then they'd have a list of who the other agencies were for fire or medical or whatever, and they could send you over to them. But it took a while, and these jurisdictional boundaries can get really complicated. So sometimes it'd take being transferred 2 or 3 times before you ended up with the ambulance service in your area. So this was a legitimate problem. So in 1996, the FCC made an order for E911. And what they did is they basically required the mobile carriers to send along a phone number, the tower location, and basically it was the phone number of the mobile device that was calling, and the tower location, which is the tower that you were connected to when you were on a mobile device. Here in the Pacific Northwest, though, that tower can be a long way away and really far from where you are. If you're out in Issaquah, the tower was up on a mountain above the town, so you literally could be anywhere in town. And also, the tower on top of the mountain was picking up stuff on the other end, so you could almost be to North Bend. You could be out towards Snoqualmie, which, if you know the area, is pretty far. So, if you were calling from an analog cellular phone, then it gets even worse here, because what if you were up on the side of Tiger Mountain or something? So this data just wasn't very good. It's better than nothing, but it wasn't enough to solve the problem of where is somebody calling 911 actually located so we can send the correct help. And so, the FCC started floating some proposals, and that got privacy people very concerned, because it started to come together what the plan actually was, and that was that phones would be enabled with capability where carriers would be able to locate you with a high degree of specificity and report that to 911. And, in order to do that, technically, there's just way more that phones needed to have built in to track location than previously was the case. And so, privacy advocates really got alarmed here, because remember, still, even in 2002, phones were largely used for calls and texts. Mobile data was barely a thing. There was this thing called WAP that you could use. It was, slimmed down versions of mobile websites. There wasn't really an app ecosystem to speak of. You get these like weird Java applets. The thing that was crazily innovative then was ringtones, and barely any devices supported them. So, this idea of phones being able to track you to almost exactly where you are, that was just a really new thing. And, rightly, privacy groups were concerned, but they got run over. And this is actually the story of everything having to do with mobile location. Privacy concerns just get run over. 2005, phase 2 comes out. And what phase 2 was literally everything in phase 1, which wasn't much, plus a requirement that 95% of phones that carriers supported had GPS capability built in. And when I say GPS capability, it's air quotes around GPS, because it didn't need to be the GPS chips that we have in modern smartphones now, which is actually a full GPS receiver. It could be carrier assisted, basically using a technology very similar to the triangulation technology that caught Kevin Mitnick. And so most carriers opted to roll out with this triangulation technology. It was just expensive at the time to get full GPS built in. The technology just wasn't there. The other problem that they had is that it was an FCC requirement that the carriers convince their subscribers to upgrade, but the fines weren't very high, and it was way cheaper to pay the fines than it was to convince, to pay for people's upgrades. So carriers just kind of waited out the ordinary upgrade cycle. They paid the fines in the meantime. And so by 2005, the 90% of phones located to within 300 meters requirement wasn't really met, but by 2008, 2009, we were pretty close to that. And just to kind of give you an idea before we dive into where things started shaping up into how they are today, this is the architecture of E911. It's a really simplified diagram. And I like this particular one, which I fished off of Wikipedia, because it kind of shows the difference between how wireline and wireless work. So if you look at the wireline side, this is for phase 2, by the way, the E911 architecture. So this is, kind of what's in play today. The next version is coming, and I'll get to that. But you'd pick up a landline phone, it would hit the central office, there'd be ANI, which would go to the ALI database, and the ALI database basically is kind of like a GIS system that pulls data that that basically proves where that phone is installed in a way that's consumable by public safety access points. And then that gets all set over to the dispatch system. This is, these are standardized formats of how they work. And eventually, that location information would come in and get forwarded on to the emergency service. And 911 systems have a structured way that data interchange happens, and there are standards for how all of this stuff works and needs to be transmitted. So, mobile phones were new, and with wireless calls for phase 2, they've got a location database, which is basically, GPS coordinates. And so that's a little bit different than the, the ALI and street address guy that you're dealing with the landline, because the landline's always in a fixed location and mobile phones, move around. So what they try to do is send, GPS coordinates as to where you are, and there's a range of where those are. And so that's why if you dial 911, they can get a pretty good beat on where you are usually. It's not 100% accurate, but it's pretty close. And so this technology, one thing that I see kind of as a recurring theme is that 911 drove technology improvements in the mobile system, which then enabled a whole bunch of other technology to happen. And so, it was considered really radical in 2002 that your phone would be able to track everywhere you are at any given time. And then in 2008, Google Maps came out. And so, if you ever had like a Garmin GPS device and you had to, and it couldn't pick up a satellite when you were in a parking garage, all these problems went away with Google Maps on the iPhone. And this just wouldn't have been possible without the technology that was put in place for E911. So almost overnight, this happened really quickly. Like when smartphones got popular, and the apps that made good use of location data. I mean, I had an app that could remember where my car was. I always forget where it is at the Costco parking lot, right? So, X marks the spot, right? So this all becomes, right around 2008. That's around the time that that this stuff started getting really popular, and so we just went into a mad rush of location-based technologies. Uber is another example that came out in 2009. This is actually the 2011 version of Uber. That was the earliest screenshot that I was able to find. And the reason I like this screenshot is that it shows that even in 2009, although the location technology was pretty good, it was nowhere near as good as it is today. And so there were these map pin workarounds on apps. So you would kind of like position around a map to where you were exactly, and that would tell the driver where you were. So, and this was one such app. There's other ones. There's an app called Foursquare that I use that still has this location data pin map thing. And it's because even today, location data is pretty good, but it's not 100% accurate all the time. It's gotten really good through augmenting the information that comes from GPS. So one way that Google does it is they've basically mapped every wireless access point in the world, and so they can infer better where you are based on the strength of the wireless access points that are near you. And if you think that's pretty creepy, well, just wait until later in my presentation. So 2011, there's this test case that came out. And we've had quite a few talks over the years at Hope on cell site location data and who can access it, what that really means from a legal perspective. And the EFF fought this really hard. 2011, the FBI was investigating some robberies, and so they just decided to go around and try to figure out who all the cell phones were in the area of a crime. And they were trying to catch the thief. So they just issued a general warrant to the. Actually, they didn't even issue a general warrant. They didn't have a warrant. They just asked Metro PCS to give them the records, and they did. And this actually went all the way to the Supreme Court, and numerous courts said, yeah, sure, like phone companies can give up whatever they want to the police without any warrants needed. And it eventually got to the Supreme Court saying that, and the Supreme Court disagreed, and they said, actually, you need a warrant for this. So I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind. If the police are going to do something, they need a warrant if they're getting it from the phone company. And that might be a premonition to something. So 2019, last year, Rape Bombs Act. So what that's requiring now is, there's this problem in tall buildings where if you call 911, the address is there, but it's hard to know which floor somebody had a heart attack on, and especially if they can't communicate with you really well. And with all these mass shootings and other incidents, where people can call 911 but not necessarily talk, it's gotten concerning to emergency services that they have the ability to locate people not just at an address or within a few hundred feet when you look at something just as a flat surface, but kind of how can they identify specifically where you are inside of a building? And there was talk that this act would include mobile phones. And, that's pretty tough right now because the geospatial data is just not quite there today to really be able to determine where inside of a building you are. I mean, you'd have to put Bluetooth beacons all over the place or something. So once the infrastructure is there, you can infer that this kind of capability is going to be expected in mobile phones as well. So we won't be just looking at like a flat surface, but we'll also be looking at the full 3D space. I'm not sure how that's going to work exactly. The current technology doesn't support it. 5G doesn't either. So it's going to be interesting meeting the requirements, but I think that we could see a new wave of technology that really goes full 3D inside of buildings, and that'll be enabled by requirements for 911, because that's, believe it or not, 911 is just this thing that keeps moving mobile technology forward. It gets stagnant for a while, and then there's a 911 requirement for location data, and then boom, all of these new things suddenly become available on the technology side. The minute this gets updated to require Bluetooth beacons inside of buildings or whatever, that's going to be where we get a whole bunch of hyper local mobile services, and to a degree that we don't really have today. But wait a minute, so there's a couple of slides ago, I talked about you had to have a warrant to get cell site location data. This is GasBuddy. And if you look under the settings menu and then you go to additional settings and then you go to location, then you see this, and it's like, wait a minute, they're just really burying it. They don't want you to see this. So Cubic got in the news lately because they have been tracking what people are actually doing on their mobile phones relative to the pandemic versus what's actually legally allowed. And they're able to see that, we have all sorts of scofflaws that are, gathering in groups and that are not following quarantine. How are they finding that data out? Because GasBuddy's narking on you, basically. And, I don't want to beat up on GasBuddy. There's a whole bunch of apps that share this information with Cubic. I shut it off. At least GasBuddy allows you to do that. Some apps don't give you the capability to shut it off. So props to GasBuddy for that. But this service is gathering precise location data if you let it, just because you have a gas app installed. And depending on the platform you're on, it could be doing this persistently all the time, like not just when you're running the app. So be aware. Your location's for sale. This isn't new. In 2018, and the link's right here, the New York Times blew the lid off of this. They went out and bought a whole bunch of data to, track politicians. It got very noticed when they did this. There was a whole bunch of, political controversy over it. And then, like many other things in the privacy space, it just blew over. Very little changed. All of this is still happening. It's just different companies involved. There's a different veneer of legitimacy. There was like no veneer of legitimacy in 2018. Now there's a veneer of legitimacy, which I'll get to later. So, it's not just apps doing this. Cell carriers are selling your real-time phone location data as well. So, cell providers got caught selling your real-time location data to these data brokers. And so these are like middlemen that would be intermediaries between the carriers who had the location data and somebody that wanted it. And there was a high-profile article where a bounty hunter went and tracked down somebody's, physical location based just on their mobile number. And it was one of these shady data brokers that had very few controls at all on who could buy the data. So if you just knew who this company was and you paid them not very much money, if you wanted to stalk your ex or whatever nefarious thing, find out where the president is, you could just pay these guys a little bit of money and they just get the information straight from the carrier. You know, kind of a security problem, kind of a privacy problem. So, you know, the carriers said that they'd stop doing it. They haven't, I don't think. I can't prove it, but I can prove that there's data that would be very hard to get from anyone other than carriers. So we'll get to that. Anyhow, the underlying point is that carriers have repeatedly been caught selling information, and they promised to stop, and then they've been caught again doing it. And you know, the reality is it's just too lucrative to sell this information to data brokers. That data is very valuable. So again, not every reason why a carrier would want, why somebody would want information from a carrier is nefarious, right? Location Smart's the first company that got caught doing this. And what they appear to be selling now is a service to help banks stop credit card fraud. And how they do that is they look at, well, when you're, you know, running a transaction, is your mobile device in the vicinity of that transaction? So if they know your phone number, they can ping the carrier will paddle on where you physically are, and they can match that up with whether you really are in a bodega in Brooklyn when you really live in, you know, the South Puget Sound in Washington, like I do. And instead of immediately getting flagged for fraud, like happened every time I went to Hope, you know, for years, because New York is kind of the epicenter of fraud. And so if you use a credit card there and you're not often in New York, you know, if you're like me and you went to Hope in past years, you probably remember at least one of your credit cards getting shut off because you used it in New York and you had to call the bank. Well, now they can just ask your phone company, is this guy really in New York? Is T-Profit there? And if the answer is yes, then maybe they don't shut your card off. So it could save you time. They can also establish what they call a smart zone around your consumer home area, and then you get real-time alerts when you're legitimately traveling if you're the bank. So, you know, maybe what you do if you're a bank is you whitelist transactions, or you have an allow list for transactions, to use the new term. Sorry, I'm old. I'm trying to get better, I promise. And what you do is you have the allow list, and you put that around the consumer's home area, and then, you know, you could base that on zip code potentially, right? And, you know, if somebody's traveling, like, you could get real-time alerts. So if they show up at a gas station in, you know, Grants Pass, Oregon, and they live where I am, and it's pay at the pump, and that seems a little bit unusual, well, you'll be able to ask the carrier, hey, did, you know, T-Profit really drive south on I-5, like, for most of a day? And if the answer is yes, then you just let the transaction go through, right? So some other location, but, you know, those two things, when I look at that, it's how else would you get that without the person knowing? You know, if I installed an app on the phone, or if I got like a push notification or something, you know, these are ways that the technology could work, but that's all with my consent and with my action. But, you know, banks aren't doing this. There's very few banks that'll ping you when you make a transaction suspicious and unlock it. There's a handful that do, but, you know, some banks are just you know, seem to mysteriously know when you're doing things that are legit versus not, and it seems to be these kinds of platforms. So another clue that this is potentially, this location as a service platform is potentially in cahoots with the carriers, is they claim that they have presence detection for indoor locations, and they've got secure cross-carrier access to mobile and landline devices. So that'd be really hard, right? Presence detection for indoor locations for, you know, with a mobile phone, that would require knowing whether a cell site is a microcell. And very few people would know that other than the carrier. mobile and landline device location. Well, your mobile device location from a carrier, secure cross carrier, that means that, they have to be getting it from the carrier. We're not talking about an app here. We're talking about the carrier giving location smart data feed. So there's another company called Zoomigo. I hope I'm saying their name right. These Silicon Valley names are very special sometimes. Okay, verifying full name, secondary account name, home address. You could maybe do that from public databases or something, but wait a minute, we're looking at these risk factors: mobile, fixed, VoIP, new accounts, burner phones. Who has that information other than the carrier? Who has information about name and address changes, activation, deactivation date, or number porting other than the carrier? So clearly, and I retrieved both of these screenshots today from their respective websites. This stuff is live right now. So, don't accept any excuses that, oh, it's just an old page and it's old data and we promised we wouldn't do that and we respect to, nothing is more important to you than our privacy, blah, blah, blah. I don't believe it, because all of this stuff is here today, even after these companies have been raked over the coals. So I think they're just selling this right now. And the way they've been able to sell it seems to align with something that happened with my Wells Fargo account, which is the consent loophole. So apropos of nothing, on my December statement from Wells Fargo, which is one of the banks that I have an account with, I got this interesting consent loophole. Yeah, most people don't read this stuff. It's in the fine print at the bottom of your statement. I read this. And so I went and read through here, and it's like, wait a minute. You authorize your wireless operator to disclose your mobile number, name, address, email, network status, customer type, customer role, billing type, mobile device identifiers, IMSI and IMEI, and other subscriber and device details, whatever those are, if available, to Wells Fargo and service providers for the duration of the business relationship, solely for identity verification and fraud avoidance. Okay, that's interesting. It's so, and then they direct you to their privacy policy, which basically says you have no privacy. And then there's the other fun thing that says you represent that you're the owner of the mobile phone number or have the delegated legal authority to act on behalf of the mobile subscriber to provide this consent. So let's unpack this a little. If I gave my mobile phone number to the bank when I signed up for an account 10 years ago, or more than that, they've turned this into they're allowed to track me just with my phone number by asking my move carrier. And so I think this is the way that these data brokers are able to continue buying from the mobile carriers. What's likely to have happened is the mobile carriers told them, look, we need consent. We need consent between the principal and the mobile carrier for us to give up this information. So, they went and told their customers to update their terms that, specifically it's not a data broker, but it's between the carrier and the subscriber. And, because with banks, they can just update the terms whenever they want to, and you implicitly agree because that's how the contracts are written. That's what this has turned into. Like, Wells Fargo can track you. So fraud avoidance, that's an interesting one. What does Wells Fargo consider fraud? Do they consider fraud avoiding a repossession? Could they use your phone number to track your phone to maybe repo your car if you miss your payment? It is concerning to me that contracts can be updated this way and this level of information can be made available to your bank with you probably not even having any idea that's what they're doing or what they're using it for. So it would be nice to see some details on exactly what's being done with this information, what Wells Fargo considers fraud, or identity verification, and why they consider mobile carrier subscriber information to be valid identity verification in the first place. So that gets to, all right, so my bank's tracking me, my gas app is tracking me. How in the world can I fight back against this? You know, especially if we've got new spooky stuff like spatially aware E911 coming down the pipe. Well, it's tough. Here's some things you can do. First thing is go scrub your apps. You know, if you don't need an app installed and it's free, there is probably a reason why it's free. It is likely to be gathering information and selling it. So if there's an app you really need to keep, limit the permissions of the app. You can do this at a really granular level in the latest Android. And so you can go in there and say, for this app, these are the specific things that are allowed. And you can even specify when it's allowed. And I recommend that you always only allow an app to do something if you're actually using the app. There are very few apps that need access to run in the background and move data around without your consent. There's a handful, but the majority of apps, you know, when you're just using location, you should really only need to be using that interactively. Don't give your mobile phone number to corporations. We see what happens if you give it to Wells Fargo. Say you only have a landline. So no matter how many times they beg and plead, and you know, if you don't have a mobile phone number on file with companies, which I don't, every time I log into something, bam, I'm getting, you know, prompted for a mobile phone number, like everything from eBay to like every bank that I'm with. It's just like, nope, I'm old fashioned. I only have a landline. So yeah, there's not a whole lot they can do if that's all you've got, except there's one bank, Basque Bank, which will not let you have an account if you don't have a mobile phone. They are literally digitally, you know, enforcing the digital divide. You are not allowed to sign up for an account with that bank if you do not have a mobile phone. I went around and around with them. I'm like, I only have a landline. What do we do? And they're like, well, we don't want you as our customer if you don't have a mobile phone. That's the bottom line. Whether it's legal or not, I'm not sure. Seems like digital redlining to me, but that is a separate talk. Use phone proxy services. So what's a phone proxy service? Google Voice is a good one. Keep in mind that if you give all your information to Google, who knows what they're doing with it. I have to make trade-offs in my life. So, you know, the ecosystem that you pick is going to be Google or Apple. And I'm in the Google ecosystem, so I picked Google Voice, which works pretty seamlessly with it. The upside of using a phone proxy service is that there's no subscriber information that they can pull. That subscriber information is Google. And when I'm giving somebody my phone number, you know, Google Voice has the ability to work with SMS. It does voice calls. You can get MMS, but it isn't wrapped up in your carrier. So getting the location data is really hard if all you have is my Google Voice number. So the flip side of that is the more privacy that you assert, the shadier you may look to algorithms. And so, you know, I assert a fairly high degree of privacy. Not really. I mean, like, I'm really reachable, but I don't give up a ton of information that can be used nefariously without my knowledge. So it looks pretty shady to the algorithms, right? If I'm using Google Voice, a lot of stuff just blocks me out. Not giving a mobile phone number to corporations looks a little bit weird. You know, it is some inconvenience having to go through and scrub my apps and, you know, kick stuff off my phone periodically that doesn't need to be there. But that's what I do. I also have some other, you know, things that I do to maintain privacy in my life. I'm not nearly as crazy with it as many people in the privacy community are. I need a balance of, you know, reasonable degree of security versus, you know, a reasonable degree of privacy. And I think that I've struck it for my personal use case. Another thing you can do is you can just hack the algorithm. So if you use a prepaid mobile service, that'll show up as a burner phone if you've never registered it. But if you register it, it just shows up as a mobile account. So register everything with a name and address. And I would like to remind you that Emmanuel Goldstein, PO Box 752, Middle Island, New York 11953 is not your name and address. You know, another thing you can do, like one thing that you know, I don't think enough people do to preserve privacy is use corporations and LLCs and trusts for doing that. It's really easy to form an LLC, pretty easy to form a corporation, not very expensive to maintain any of them. And then that gives you the ability to open business accounts for everything. So you can open business bank accounts, business phone accounts, business credit cards, and then everything's in the business name, which for whatever reason, because corporations tend to trust businesses, ends up ranked higher trust by the algorithm. So I've got all this business stuff because I legitimately own a business, and I'm able to use those resources to be able to get around a lot of the algorithms hating me in my personal life. And then one other really fun thing that I like to do, just because I have phone numbers all over the world, is to register for services using those foreign phone numbers. I lived and worked in Europe for a year, and so I have a Dutch phone number. I register for everything that might be a GDPR headache for companies using my Dutch phone number. And you know, what that automatically does is it just turns off a lot of the more intrusive and annoying privacy practices because they're not compatible with GDPR. So if you've got a phone number, you know, you can use these algorithms to your advantage by running them through different filters. And that is one thing that you can do. So that's my punch list. I'm happy to answer more in the Q&A, you know, give you some ideas. And what I want to do here is thank you. Thanks for putting up with this crazy format for a talk. This was one shot and go. I'm not going to go back and tweak and this edit because the talk's pre-recorded at the last possible second. It's 1:12 in the morning right now. This is due right now. So it's not going to be as polished as I normally am. But hey, it is 9 Days of Hope. Thanks so much for supporting Hope, for supporting 2600. You're what makes all of this possible, and I really mean that. So thanks for not demanding a refund and being here for this crazy experiment, and I hope to see you all in person in 2 years in New York. Thanks again, and we'll get to the Q&A, hopefully on a live session starting right now. Bye.
Thank you, T. Prophet, very much. And as Pascu just mentioned, we have a few minutes for Q&A. So please, if you're in our audience on Matrix, leave them in the live stream Q&A channel, and we can ask them. One question from the audience: do we need BT beacons in future if infrastructure continues to improve and includes 5G's precise location features?
So that really is going to be up to 911. What is required by 911 and what technical specifications come out. You know, updating building code and doing it at a nationwide level is a very complicated thing, as you can imagine. And there may be a better technology that comes along than Bluetooth. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily going to be based on that. Bear in mind that, you know, if we go with Bluetooth beacons as the technical layer, that means Bluetooth has to be able to come on whether you want it on or not. It means that it's going to be draining your battery. So I don't think it's the best technology. It's the best one we have right now for this kind of thing, but there's new research all the time, and I think that there's a lot of possibilities in the future. Do I think that E911 regulations are going to get updated to try to identify you inside of a building? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't do a whole lot of good if you're at a giant stadium, for example, and you dial 911 and you know, the only thing the fire department knows if you've had a heart attack is that you're somewhere in that stadium. So we can see this coming. It's just a question of exactly how it's going to be implemented and when.
Next question from the audience. What is the best way to balance the security benefit of two-factor authentication with the fact that you must turn over to them your mobile number?
That's a really tough one because a lot of the time 2FA is a Trojan horse to get your mobile number and maybe track you with it. So the way that I do it is twofold. The first is I have a separate device just for multi-factor authentication, and I use that separate device with non-SMS based multi-factor authentication services. And there's a lot of things that you can use, like Google Authenticator, for example, that don't require you to get an SMS, but do give you the benefit of multi-factor authentication. And in fact, it's better than SMS based multi-factor authentication because it's more secure. The problem is that if anything ever happens to that device, then you've lost your 2FA tokens. It gets pretty complicated to untangle yourself from that problem then. So it's just, again, going to be kind of a security versus convenience question. The other thing that I do with SMS 2FA is phone proxy services like Google Voice do support these. It's just a question of whether they're using a service to rate whether your phone number is shady and allow you to use it or not. So for example, a couple of banks that I do business with refuse to accept the Google Voice number. They consider that to be totally shady and it's not a valid option at all. Wells Fargo, in fact, refused to accept the Google Voice number, so they sent me a hardware token for multi-factor authentication. And so that's what I have to use. But normally they charge for it, and because I only have a landline and that was the only way I could get SMSs, they waived the normal $35 fee and sent me the hard token for free. So small victories, I guess.
Next question, have you seen other industries saying the no phone, no account to you? Or do you know of other companies that have similar practices?
Basque Bank is the first one that I've run into that's done this. And, when they told me this, I couldn't really believe it because there are a lot of parts of the country where you still can't really get mobile phone service. The more rural and remote that you're in, if you're in, anywhere from Stehekin, Washington to halfway up the Haul Road in Alaska, there are just lots of places where mobile phone service isn't available yet. It's not a lot of people, but there is a lot of geography, right? So are we going to enforce a digital divide through banking? Are we going to draw a digital red line around rural areas and say people who live in these places and can only get a landline can't have a bank account now? We're in uncharted territory. And so far, the banks are doing that. At least one bank is, Basque Bank. And it's kind of an open question as to what else is going to do that and whether or not it's going to remain legal. But I don't think it should be. And if you don't think it should be, you should probably talk to your Congress people.
Another member of the audience asks, to what extent can E911 location be spoofed on a commercially available phone?
I don't even want to get into that. And the reason why I don't want to get into that is there's a thing called swatting, and that's just not something that I am even willing to help anybody consider doing.
Okay. I think this will have to be the last question. We're just about out of time, but someone asks, do you know if anyone has tried using GPS spoofing so the mobile phone thinks it's somewhere else? Would that set off an alarm when it doesn't jive with the location provided by tower triangulation?
So I don't know what the thrust of the question is, but what I can say is that, so many of you know that I used to run a dating app called Cuddly. And oh yeah, there sure are GPS spoofing apps. If you have a rooted Android phone or a rooted iOS device, there are location spoofing apps that exist for this. And we see that all the time in dating apps now, where usually it's innocuous. People are just, located in Lagos and trying to scam somebody in the US. So actually not so innocuous. That's 99% of the use case, and then 1% is just lonely people who don't have anybody around them in their remote areas. They're trying to, make themselves virtually closer to a city. So yeah, these things do exist. They can be used for nefarious purposes or not. I'm not going to get into the 911 use case with these kinds of apps.
Absolutely. T-Prophet, thank you very much, and thank you all for watching.
All right, thanks a lot.